Ni hao, welcome to this session on ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting, where we're going to answer the question, or the questions, what are they and do they work?
大家好，非常高兴各位来跟我们一起进入到生酮饮食和间歇性进食的课程学习当中。我们今天呢，主要解决的问题就是它们是什么，以及它们真的有效吗？
And so, in order to understand ketogenic diets, we have to spend a little bit of time understanding the role of fats in metabolism.
我们为了帮助大家更好的了解生酮饮食，首先要了解一下我们身体能量代谢的一个途径是什么样子的。
So I know the picture you're looking at is very complex. Don't worry, we're going to keep it simple. We're only going to look at a certain few things that we need to understand in order to talk about ketones.
我知道大家看到这张图的时候一定觉得它非常的复杂，但是没关系，我们会尽量把它简化，只看其中跟生酮饮食相关的部分就可以了。
So the first thing I would have you look at is if you look at the three macronutrients, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, they kind of all merge down at the bottom where they enter the Krebs cycle, and that is aerobic respiration.
那我们可以看到，像我们常见的三大宏量营养素，脂肪、甘油三酯、碳水化合物跟蛋白质，它们进入到身体之后都会被转换成为更小的分子。
But the problem that we have is when you look at a fat that's made up of fatty acids and a glycerol molecule, the fatty acids are too big in their original state to enter the energy pathways.
那我们来看一下，甘油三酯主要是由脂肪酸和甘油构成的，但是脂肪酸它的分子结构是非常大的，所以造成它进入我们能量代谢通路的时候会变得比较困难一些。
So what we have to do is take these long chain fatty acids, they can be very long, and we have to break them up into 2 carbon pieces in order to prepare them for entry into the Krebs cycle.
所以当脂肪酸想要进入能量代谢的时候，首先它要把长链的脂肪酸切成双碳的片段，然后进入到贝塔氧化，把它转化成为乙酰辅酶 A。
And so that process is called beta oxidation because the first carbon is the alpha carbon, the second carbon is the beta carbon, so we are breaking up these fats into 2 carbon pieces. They call it beta oxidation.
所以我们刚刚讲过的，把长链的脂肪酸从16到24碳这种长链的切成双碳片段的过程，就叫做贝塔氧化。
Now, that 2 carbon fragment that is produced is called Acetyl Coenzyme A, and that is a compound that is ready now to enter the Krebs cycle.
接下来呢，双碳片段会被转换成为乙酰辅酶 A， 进入到柠檬酸循环当中去。
But there is a problem. Acetyl Coenzyme A cannot enter the Krebs cycle by itself.
但是这边有一个问题，就是我们的乙酰辅酶 A 呢，它是不能够依靠自己的力量进入柠檬酸循环的。
So if you look at the carbohydrate pathway, we get to pyruvate, and then what you see is that curved line, right? That's kind of going out here, and we see pyruvate is forming a compound, and that compound joins with acetyl coenzyme A to enter the Krebs cycle.
那我们再来看一下碳水化合物的这个能量通路里面，当糖转换成为丙酮酸的时候，这边有一条曲线是直接进入到柠檬酸循环的。这就意味着，我们的脂肪想要进入柠檬酸循环的话，需要丙酮酸来帮忙。
And so what we're saying really is that in order for fats to enter the Krebs cycle, as the acetyl coenzyme A, they need a partner coming from carbohydrates. What that means is in order to metabolize fats completely, you have to have carbohydrates present.
那如果我们希望脂肪它可以充分的进入到柠檬酸循环，为我们身体提供能量的话，是需要从丙酮酸，也就是碳水化合物的副产物这边获得一些帮助的。
But what's interesting is if you look at this pathway, pyruvate not only makes that product, but pyruvate can also make acetyl coenzyme A. So what we know is that carbohydrates can be metabolized aerobically by themselves without fats, but fats cannot be metabolized aerobically without carbohydrates.
那有趣的是，我们可以看到丙酮酸除了可以变成辅助脂肪氧化的物质之外，它还可以直接转换成为乙酰辅酶 A。所以碳水化合物它自己本身是可以进入到能量代谢过程的，但是脂肪却需要依赖碳水化合物的帮忙。
So what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit more closely at this pyruvate, acetyl coenzyme A, and Krebs cycle. So we're going to do a slightly more detailed look at it.
好，那我们接下来的时间就把丙酮酸乙酰辅酶 A 和柠檬酸循环的这条通路更仔细的来看一下。
So, to start explaining this, as you saw previously, pyruvate forms a compound, and that compound is called oxaloacetate. That compound binds with acetyl coenzyme A to go into the Krebs cycle.
那我们刚刚一直讲丙酮酸，它可以转换成一个物质，帮助脂肪进入柠檬酸循环。这个物质的名字就叫做草酰乙酸。
But now let's think of some situations. What if you were fasting, extreme fasting? What if you were starving? What if you had a low carbohydrate diet, or you were restricting carbohydrates, or you were depleted of carbohydrates? Or what if you had uncontrolled diabetes where you could not get glucose into the cell? How would this pathway work?
我们现在来思考一下，如果你在严格的禁食或者饥饿状态，或者执行低碳水化合物饮食，限制碳水化合物，或者进入到了一个糖原耗竭，又或者你拥有糖尿病，不可控的一个糖尿病问题，那这个时候我们的丙酮酸它如何去产生它刚刚的作用呢？
So think about it. If we have any of those situations which all represent a lack of available glucose, the problem that you have is that while fats may be metabolized to acetyl coenzyme A, the problem is you're not getting the oxaloacetate from the pyruvate, which means that those acetyl coenzyme A's are not able to enter the Krebs cycle.
我们刚刚提到的所有的状况都可能造成身体当中缺乏葡萄糖，那就会出现一个情况，脂肪依旧可以变成两碳的片段转换成为乙酰辅酶 A， 但是却没有丙酮酸可以转换成为草酰乙酸，那它们想要进入脂肪想要进入能量代谢的这个通路就被切断了。
Now, if these acetyl coenzyme A's cannot go into the energy pathway, they start to accumulate. And so the body wants to get rid of them outside of the cell. So what the body does is convert them to ketones, which can then be moved out of the cell and put into the blood.
那我们的身体里面，脂肪无法去转换成为能量代谢的一部分，它就会变成乙酰辅酶 A 囤积在我们的细胞当中。但是细胞想要把它运输出去，这时候就会把乙酰辅酶 A 变成酮体，运输到我们的血液当中。
And so again, if we dig a little deeper, all right, I'm showing you in detail here what we've been talking about. So let me explain this pathway to you.
好，我们现在再把这个学习的过程更深入一点，我们仔细的去看一下柠檬酸循环是怎么运作的。
So you might remember I said that in order for fats to enter the Krebs cycle, the acetyl coenzyme A has to bind with oxaloacetate, and it forms a compound called citrate that allows the Krebs cycle to take place.
如果大家还记得刚刚那个过程的话，我们可以发现脂肪首先被转换成为了乙酰辅酶 A， 但是乙酰辅酶 A 要在葡萄糖氨基酸转换成为的草酰乙酸的帮助之下，形成一个叫做柠檬酸盐的东西，这样才能够保证我们的柠檬酸循环是可以进行的。
And what's important to know in your cell is that in order for the Krebs cycle to continue, these compounds that you see that I've listed here, they must all remain in balance.
那我们如果想要保证柠檬酸循环是一个正常运行的状态，所有这些涉及到的中间物质的它们的浓度都必须要保持，这个平衡就是由草酰乙酸来负责的。
Now, let's say hypothetically you have no carbohydrates or insufficient carbohydrates. That means this pyruvate is not going to manufacture oxaloacetate. So now we have a problem that there's not enough of this to allow that pathway to continue.
那如果我们摄入的葡萄糖变得比较少的时候， 丙酮酸生成草酰乙酸的可能性就会变得比较低，草酰乙酸就会使我们的葡萄糖释放到血液当中去，柠檬酸循环就无法正常进行了。
But more importantly, you can also see that this oxaloacetate, while it's made from carbohydrates, it can also make glucose. And that's an important thing to understand.
那就像我刚刚说过的，丙酮酸它和我们的草酰乙酸之间是可以转换的，同时草酰乙酸它还可以变成葡萄糖氨基酸。
So in the liver, if we are deficient of carbohydrates, then what's going to happen is this oxaloacetate that normally binds with acetyl coenzyme A to make the Krebs cycle happen is in fact going to go make glucose so that the liver can release that glucose into the blood, which is needed by many of the cells of the body.
所以在我们的肝脏当中，我们的草酰乙酸呢就可以让葡萄糖通过葡萄糖氨基酸这样的一个形式被释放到血液当中去。
And so what happens is you don't get these acetyl coenzymes going into the energy pathway. They start to accumulate. So what the liver does, it converts them to ketones because ketones can be put into the blood.
那这个时候呢，乙酰辅酶 A 它就开始累积了，累积到一定程度之后，就会被转换成为酮体进入到血液，因为酮体是可以被释放出去的。
And so we start thinking about what are ketones. Well, if you think about what we've just talked about, all ketones are essentially incompletely metabolized fat fragments that are made when acetyl coenzyme A cannot enter the Krebs cycle.
那我们来讨论一下酮到底是什么样的一个含义。所以从本质上来讲，按照我们刚刚说过的，它其实就是没有办法完全代谢的一个脂肪片段，然后导致了乙酰辅酶 A 的累积，累积到一定程度之后呢，进入不了柠檬酸循环，就会转换成为酮。
Ketones are produced in the liver, and they are not a bad compound. They are actually a fuel because ketones can be converted back to acetyl coenzyme A when there's carbohydrates present, and they can be then metabolized as fuel.
那酮它所有的这个形成过程都是在肝脏当中发生的，但是它不是一个垃圾，它不是没有用的东西，而是一种能量。我们身体当中大部分的细胞跟器官都是可以使用它的。
Now, they're a fuel that can be used by just about every part of the body. There's only two locations in the body where we cannot use ketones. That is your liver, who ironically makes the ketones, but it cannot utilize them, and your red blood cells, they can only use glucose as a fuel.
我们身体当中只有2个器官和组织是完全没有办法使用酮体的。第一个就是肝脏，它负责制造了酮体，但是它却不能利用；另外一个就是红细胞。
So when would the body be making ketones? Well, to answer that question, we first must understand where and how we store carbohydrates in the body.
我们如果想要知道身体是如何制造酮体的，我们就必须先明白我们的身体碳水化合物它是发生了一个什么样的变化。
Carbohydrates are stored in your muscle cells, and carbohydrates are stored in the liver.
我们的碳水化合物呢，在人体当中可以被储存在肌肉组织和肝细胞当中。
But there's a big difference between the two. When you put carbohydrates into the muscle cells, they can never get out, which means they can only be used by that muscle as a source of fuel.
但是这两者的储存呢，却是完全不同的。如果是进入到肌肉组织当中的葡萄糖，一旦进去了就出不来，这就意味着只有肌肉组织可以使用肌糖原。
However, the liver is unique in that the liver is able to release glucose into the blood, and that's very important for our survival.
那我们肝脏当中储存的这个糖原呢，是可以随时被释放出来，转换成为葡萄糖的。这个对人类的生存来说是非常重要的。
So the liver is actually responsible for preserving your blood sugar. And you have to have blood sugar because it is the preferred fuel for the brain. But as I said, your red blood cells can only feed off of glucose. So if you don't have liver glycogen, you have a big problem.
那肝糖原对我们来说是非常重要的，因为它可以帮助我们维持血糖的浓度。这就意味着，像大脑红细胞这种只能利用糖供能的器官和组织能够得到保障。
So the problem that we have is that the liver tank is small. It can deplete itself of carbohydrates in 12 to 18 hours.
但是呢，肝糖原的一个储存量却是非常小的，它差不多在12到18个小时左右就会完全耗竭。
So if you were eating continuously and eating some carbohydrates, you would not have a problem because you would always be replenishing liver glycogen stores.
如果你是有规律的在进食，然后每一餐都有吃碳水化合物的话，就不用担心自己的肝糖原耗竭，因为会随时得到补充。
But there are situations where that is not happening. So I want you to think, every day we go through a period of our day where we're not eating. That is called overnight fasting.
那我们其实会经历过这样一个过程，就是一整晚的睡眠之后，我们没有办法去进食。
So you might, for example, eat dinner at 6 o'clock at night, but then not eat until 8 o'clock the next morning. That's 14 hours without food. Your liver tank could be getting dangerously low.
那我们来想象一下，如果你晚上的最后一餐是6点钟吃的，一直饿到第二天早上8点钟没有进食，这样长达14小时的过程呢，就会导致我们的肝糖原有耗竭的危险。
And remember, the liver needs to have carbohydrates in order to preserve blood sugar.
那我们要记得的是，肝脏它是需要摄入葡萄糖才能够释放糖原，让我们的血糖保持在合理的水平。
So it is quite feasible that every morning as you are waking up, your body, the liver more specifically, could be producing ketones.
所以每天早上我们醒来的时候，因为糖原被耗竭的话，其实身体还是会制造出一定的酮体的。
But generally what you do is when you wake up in the morning, you eat some carbohydrates. That's why in English we use the word breakfast. You are breaking the fast and you are introducing carbohydrates, and the liver now replenishes its stores and we don't have to make as many ketones.
但是呢，通常情况下，我们早上起来都是会吃东西的，这个就打破了一个进食的阶段，让我们的肝脏能够补充到葡萄糖，这个时候它就不会再去制造酮体了。
But as I mentioned on the previous slide, some people choose to restrict their carbohydrates. Some people are glycogen depleted because they're out there training for many hours. So some people choose not to eat carbohydrates, and therefore they may be making ketones not just in the morning, but throughout the entire day.
但是有些人呢，他们可能会限制自己饮食当中碳水化合物的摄入，或者他们有比较高强度的能量的一个消耗，这个会导致他们不仅仅在早上的时候血液当中存在酮，可能在其他的时间段里面也会有相同的问题。
So let's define some terms regarding or related to ketones.
那我们接下来看一下关于生酮的一些指标。
So the word ketogenesis simply implies the manufacture or the production of ketones in the body.
那我们讲的酮症呢，它就是我们在碳水耗竭或者限制期间呢，身体当中会存在比较多的酮。
And because your liver is always fluctuating with how much glycogen it has, it's quite possible that you might be involved in ketogenesis throughout the day.
那如果我们的肝糖原一直处于一个波动状态的话，在一天当中进入到一个生酮状态，其实是很常见的。
The term ketosis refers to having the presence of ketones in your blood.
那酮症这个词就意思呢，是指的我们血液当中会有微量的酮存在，但是呢，进入到碳水耗竭之后呢，这个酮体的累积就会变大。
So it's quite possible that, again, you might always have ketones in your blood.
但是我们其实血液当中一直都是存在酮体的。
And so if you look at that grading chart at the bottom, if your ketone levels in your blood are in that blue range, that is considered to be very normal.
那我们来看一下下面这一条我们的图片啊。如果你的这个血液当中的铜是在0到0.6之间的，那它就是一个比较低的状态。
So someone could take blood work from you, and they could go and analyze the blood and look for how much ketones are in your blood. Through most of your day, being in that blue range is pretty normal.
那我们有的时候会检验血糖里面，就血液当中的这样的一个铜的含量。如果你一整天都处于这个蓝色格子当中的话，那含量就是非常低的。
Now, when you and I wake up in the morning and we've gone for 12 hours, 14 hours without food, it is possible that our ketones in the blood might be a little higher. And now we're moving into that yellow zone, and that's called nutritional ketosis.
那有的时候我们经历了一整晚没有吃东西这个过程，大概12或者14个小时，就会导致我们血液当中的铜的浓度上升，我们可能会移动到黄色的格子的范围中。
So nutritional ketosis is a state that many of us experience first thing in the morning because our liver glycogen stores are starting to get low.
所以刚刚讲的这个过程呢，就叫做营养性的生酮，它是在肝糖原耗竭的状态之下暂时的一种状态。
So if you live in that blue range and that yellow range, the blue and the yellow range throughout your day, that is considered to be very normal and healthy.
那如果我们只是血液当中的酮体水平处于蓝色或者黄色的格子的话，这是很正常的事情，是健康的。
Now, there are some people that choose to restrict their carbohydrates. One way is to eat what we call a ketogenic diet that we're going to be talking about very soon.
那我们有一些同学或者朋友呢，可能会选择限制自己的一个碳水化合物的摄入，比如说他们吃一些生酮饮食，等会儿我们会讲到这个部分。
So when you start restricting your carbohydrates, it's logical that the amount of ketones that are being produced is going to increase.
如果你开始限制自己碳水化合物的摄入了，就会导致我们身体当中的血酮水平不断的升高。
And so people that are intentionally trying to reduce their carbohydrates in their diet, usually for reasons for losing weight, are trying to intentionally get themselves into that orange range, which is called starvation ketosis.
那很多的人去吃生酮饮食的一个目的，其实就是为了减肥，所以他们会比较严格的限制自己的碳水化合物，让自己的血酮水平保持在橘色的这个格子当中。那我们就把它称作饥饿性酮症。
Now, the belief is that this level of ketones is still not dangerous to your body. But the reality is we just don't know for certain.
那我们通常情况下会说，如果你的血酮水平是保持在橘色这个格子里的话，没有危险，但是这个是不确定的。
Now, we don't have long-term studies, and I'm talking about studies that go beyond 2 years, that tell us that if you live in that orange range that you're going to be healthy. Right now, short-term studies, right, seem to indicate that it is considered to be pretty safe, but we don't know what it would look like 5 to 10 years from now. We have to wait and see what the research will tell us.
因为目前为止我们所做的实验全部都是短期实验，只能够证明在短期当中我们的血酮保持在橘色的这个范围里面是没有危险性的，但是没有人能告诉我们，如果是长期，比如说5到10年去这样坚持的话，会不会对我们的身体安全产生影响。
And so when you're on a ketogenic diet, what you were trying to do is to get into that state, because that is now where the body has undergone a bit of a adaptation. We call it becoming keto adapted, to try and feed on more fats because there are not enough carbs.
那在这个状态之下呢，我们的身体它自然而然的就会更多的使用脂肪，产生更多的酮体，因为我们是缺乏碳水的一个状态。
And you can see at the very bottom of the page, I give you an example of a factoid where I say the brain generally derives only about 25% of its energy on a daily basis from ketones. But this number can increase to almost 70% in as little as 6 weeks of carbohydrate restriction.
就像我在这个 PPT 上面给大家罗列的这个例子，我们的大脑呢，平时会从同类当中获取的能量其实只有25%，但是如果你限制碳水化合物的摄入，大概6周左右，这个比例就会增加到70%。
And so that's what's happening. The body is learning how to feed off of more fats. And that's what we're trying to do when we put you onto a ketogenic diet and we take you into starvation ketosis.
那我们的身体它其实是在不断的学习如何利用更多的脂肪来为自己提供能量的。这个过程就是我们希望在生酮饮食当中产生的一个同适应。
There is a little bit of a side effect when you learn to become keto adapted. It takes several days to maybe a few weeks, and generally you go through a process where you experience symptoms much like you're getting sick. You feel like you've got a cold, you feel weak. That's your body learning to adapt to burning more fats.
但是在同适应的这个过程当中，大概是在几周左右，我们可能会经历一种身体的不适，你会感觉自己像感冒了一样，然后觉得自己很虚弱。这其实就是一个身体在学习利用脂肪的过程。
Now, while starvation ketosis may not be dangerous, what we do know is if you start getting more and more ketones in your blood, the problem that we have with ketones is they're very acidic and they change the pH of your blood.
但是我们前面说过，在橘色范围里面虽然是安全的，可是如果你身体当中的酮酸一直堆积的话，就会改变血液的 pH 值，让我们出现风险。
And so generally we talk about if we measure your blood and your ketone levels are in that range of the red, so 12 to 25 millimoles per liter, that becomes very dangerous because the amount of ketones is going to lower the pH of your blood. And that'll damage a lot of the sensitive proteins in your blood that could kill you.
那我们如果去测量自己血液当中的一个酮体水平，发现它处于12到25毫摩每升，也就是红色这个范围的话，就很容易导致我们血液的酸性下降，这个是会带来致命风险的。
And so what we want to do is to make sure that we don't allow our clients to get any increase in ketones that takes them beyond the orange band.
所以我们要确定的是，就是保证我们的客户血酮水平不要超过橘色的范围。
So how do we measure your ketone levels? There's only one particular way. You have to take a blood test. The tests that are using breath are not accurate at all. So if you want to know where your ketones are, you have to go get blood work taken.
所以保持这个范围最好的方法就是帮助你的客户去测量他们的血酮，这个是最安全有效的。
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the role of ketones. Let's talk about ketogenic diets.
那我们刚刚聊了生酮的一些能量代谢的通路，接着我们就来跟大家探讨一下什么是生酮饮食。
So what we know about a ketogenic diet is that it's a very low carbohydrate diet.
那我们都知道，生酮饮食是一个非常严格限制碳水化合物的饮食方法。
The definitions of a ketogenic diet is a diet where the carbohydrates make up no more than 5% of all the calories.
在生酮饮食里面，要求碳水化合物的摄入在总能量当中要低于5%。
And generally that means that the carbohydrates are not going to exceed 50 grams per day.
差不多每天连50克的碳水都吃不到。
That's very hard to do because if I take my hand and I take just a handful of rice, we call it a third of a cup, that's already 15 grams of carbs. So if I take a big heaped handful, which is still not much, of rice, that itself can be 50 grams of carbs.
这其实是非常难做到的。你们可以看到，我们把一小块的米饭放在手上的话，其实就很容易超过50克。你稍微增加一点，这个量就超标了。
And so what a ketogenic diet is generally made up of is very low carbohydrates, but then very high fats. About 70 to 80% of the calories come from fat.
但是在生酮饮食当中，却有70%到80%的能量都是由脂肪来提供的。
And the balance, 10 to 20%, comes from protein.
然后剩下的大概10到20%的能量是由蛋白质来提供的。
And you can see from the examples I provided how the ketogenic diet differs from many other types of diets that people can follow.
那我们可以看到生酮饮食跟其他的一些人们比较容易遵循的饮食方法之间的一些对比。
But what's interesting is to note is that in the US we have an RDA for carbohydrates. That means on a daily basis, every adult should be eating about 130 grams of carbohydrates because that amount is needed for normal physiological function.
那我们在美国的话，会对人们有一个最低的碳水化合物摄入建议，就是至少每天要维持在130克，这样才能够保证我们的中枢神经的运转是最佳状态。
But that's a problem because the ketogenic diet is only recommending 50 grams, yet the RDA is 130 grams.
那比较有趣的是呢，我们希望自己的那个脂肪的一个摄入大概保持在30%左右。
And that becomes a challenge because as trainers and practitioners, we are supposed to respect scope of practice. And our scope of practice is to recommend the dietary guidelines that are set forth by the government.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
I said that creates a problem for us because as trainers, we are supposed to respect scope of practice. And scope of practice tells us that we need to follow the dietary guidelines, which means that we should be recommending 130 grams every day, but yet a ketogenic diet is only 50 grams.
OK， 所以对于我们来说，其实这件事情还是会有一个问题存在的，就是作为一个教练，我们其实应该遵循一些膳食指南上面的规定，让大家每天保证至少有130克的碳水摄入。但是目前为止，如果做生酮饮食的话，就做不到这一点。
So why does the government set a guideline of 130 grams as a minimum for every adult every day?
那为什么我们的政府是需要给到大家一个130克作为最低建议的呢？
Because it is believed that at 130 grams, you are preserving normal function of all the systems in the body, but more importantly, you're also not attacking muscle protein to make carbohydrates.
那最重要的一个点就是，这130克可以保证我们身体的一个正常机能的运转。
So the belief is if you go onto a very low carbohydrate diet, you may be attacking some of your muscle protein, which is something that you should always consider before contemplating following a ketogenic diet.
那我们在遵循极低碳的一个饮食过程中，就比较容易导致糖原不足，而引发蛋白质的过度消耗。这个是在你选择生酮饮食之前需要明白的一点。
Now, before we start, talk about the research around ketogenic diets, let's look at how the diet ranks against other diets.
那我们在讲生酮饮食的一些相关研究之前，我们可以看一下它跟其他饮食之间的一个对比是什么样子的。
So every year, a publication called the US and World Report, they do an annual review or an annual report on the diets.
那每年呢，我们的美国新闻跟世界报道都会总结一个全年的最佳饮食的一个总结。
So what they do is they bring together a bunch of experts and they basically look at the top diets that are out there and they ask them to evaluate them based on 7 categories.
他们会将每一种饮食呢，大概分成7类，来对它们进行评分。
And what I'm listing here is what diets are the top 5, and then I'm also showing you the bottom diets, and the ketogenic diet, unfortunately, is ranked at the bottom.
那我们可以看一下前5名的这个饮食，我已经为大家罗列出来了，包括最后3名的一个饮食。生酮饮食其实是排名在36名左右的。
Now, also, when they look at diets and how hard they are to follow, the ketogenic diet is also very difficult to follow because it is very restrictive of carbohydrates.
那从依从度这个角度来进行探讨的话，生酮饮食其实也不那么容易被实施，所以它的排名在32左右。
So, let's talk about the research and the claims that are made with ketogenic diets.
那接下来的时间，我们讨论一下关于生酮饮食的一些研究。
First thing is this idea of eating low carbohydrates is not new. It's been around for 40, 50 years already. In 1972, we had the Atkins diet, which was a high-fat, low-carb diet.
其实低碳饮食这个概念一点都不新鲜了，距离我们大概50、60年左右，差不多在1972年的时候就已经存在这样的一些概念了。
And so, when we look at the claims that are being made, some of the claims about ketogenic diets is that it helps people lose weight and it helps improve their health. And there's actually some good research supporting that.
那我们一直听说生酮或者是低碳饮食，对减肥还有帮助我们去获取健康来说是有帮助的。确实有一些研究证明了这些帮助。
And so, their claims that they're making is that if you eat a ketogenic diet, you will eat less calories, we will suppress your appetite, you will lose weight, and you can also improve your health, like insulin sensitivity.
那会有一些假设是说，如果我们吃生酮饮食的话，会帮助我们摄入更少的热量，然后给我们带来更强的饱腹感，同时呢，也可以促进减肥，以及促进我们的健康。比如说，它会提高我们胰岛素的敏感性。
There are also some claims on ketogenic diets and athletic performance.
还会有一些研究呢，是关于生酮饮食和运动表现的。
Some of the claims speak to helping the body burn more fats and spare carbohydrates.
那这些研究显示，在我们吃生酮饮食的过程当中，运动员会更多的燃烧脂肪，这样是可以节省糖原的使用的。
There are some claims that ketogenic diets will improve your body composition for athletes.
他们还会强调说，这样的一个过程会提高运动员的一个身体成分。
And one thing that has been addressed with ketogenic diets is the fact that when you train at high intensities, your body shifts to carbohydrates. So if you're on a ketogenic diet, you cannot train hard, which means you're going to lose strength and power.
但是我们要注意的是，在高强度运动的过程当中，身体没有办法有效的使用脂肪和酮体，所以我们如果吃生酮饮食的话，就不能够进行高强度的训练。
So let's look at some of the research. What are the takeaways from the research that's out there?
那我们再看一下一些其他的相关研究。
The first thing about a ketogenic diet is, can it help people lose weight? And the research says yes.
第一个就是关于生酮是否能够帮助人们减肥的这个观点。那研究发现是可以的。
So the question is, why and how?
那我们要问一下，它为什么可以帮助呢？以及它如何帮助？
Well, what we know is this. When people tend to eat low carbohydrate diets and they replace it with more fats, they tend to eat less calories.
那我们可以发现，在生酮饮食的时候呢，我们吃了大量的脂肪，就会减少对碳水化合物的一个摄入。
If they're eating less calories and they're eating fats and proteins, which can also do what? Stay in your stomach for longer, and that can help suppress your appetite, then it makes sense that you're going to lose weight.
那我们吃比较少的碳水的时候，就意味着脂肪跟蛋白质吃的量大了，而这两个食物呢，能够给我们提供更长时间的饱腹感，也就是可以帮助我们有效的抑制食欲。
So the question has been asked, is there something special about the ketogenic diets helping people lose weight, or is it just simply a function of eating less calories?
其实生酮饮食并不是一个特殊的可以帮助我们来减肥的一个功能，它主要还是通过影响了一个热量来帮助我们减肥的。
So studies that have compared different types of diets where they controlled the calories found that the weight loss is the same, which tells us that there's nothing magical about the fats in the ketogenic diet. It's simply a fact of losing weight because you're eating less calories.
所以有很多的研究把生酮饮食跟一些卡路里限制的饮食放在一起做比较，然后会发现其实生酮饮食没有什么特别的，不是因为脂肪有很大的神奇的功能，而是因为它在某种程度上面减少了卡路里的摄入。
We also know that if you're able to reduce the calories you eat and the carbohydrates that you eat, you can improve insulin sensitivity. So yes, a ketogenic diet can be helpful for someone who's worried about diabetes.
那同时，当我们减少卡路里摄入跟碳水的时候，胰岛素的敏感性也自然而然的提高了。
Another concern that's always been raised is if you're eating that much fat, 70 to 80% of your calories from fat, will that not change your lipid profiles? In other words, elevate your cholesterol?
那还会有一些困惑，就是当我们吃如此大量的脂肪的时候，会不会对我们的一个心血管产生影响？
Well, here's what was interesting in the research studies. In the studies that were looking at the lipid profiles, what they were doing is they were feeding people high amounts of healthy polyunsaturated fats. And we know that diets that have high amounts of polyunsaturated fats can actually improve your lipid profile.
那在一项研究当中就发现，如果我们在生酮饮食的过程当中，尽可能多吃多不饱和的脂肪，就可以帮助我们比较好的改善血脂。
But we have two problems here. Number one is the weight loss appears when you control calories. And number two, the lipid profiles improve when you control the type of fat that's being eaten.
所以我们可以总结以下2点：第一个，如果你想减肥的话，热量控制是最重要的一件事情；第二个，如果你希望改善血脂，那就要多吃一些不饱和的脂肪酸。
So if you're controlling calories, which is hard to do in people's normal lives, then every diet should give us the same results. And that's where the ketogenic diet can be helpful. Because we're not controlling calories, what happens naturally when people eat more fat is that they eat less calories.
那其实如果人们不去控制热量，但是疯狂的去吃脂肪而减少碳水的话，也是没有办法去获得更多的健康效用的。
However, when you let people choose to eat what fats they want, chances are they're not going to eat only healthy polyunsaturated fats. So ketogenic diets where you are controlling the fats can improve your lipids. Otherwise, they may decrease or make your lipids worse.
那另外一方面，如果你在生酮饮食的时候吃的都是很多不健康的脂肪，它不但没有办法帮你改善血脂，还会让你的血脂健康更加糟糕。
Okay, so there's some of the takeaways from the research on health and weight loss. Let's look at some of the discoveries on performance.
好，了解完健康、减肥跟生酮的关系之后，我们再来看一下生酮对运动表现的影响。
So the claim that if you follow a ketogenic diet, you can improve your body composition is true because if you're eating less calories, you are losing weight, you should be improving your body composition.
那一些相关的研究表示，当我们吃低碳饮食的时候呢，就会改善身体成分。但这个身体成分的改善是因为你的卡路里摄入变少了，自然而然的瘦下去之后得到的改善。
So again, there's nothing magical about the ketogenic diet. It's just a fact that on a high-fat diet, you are just eating less calories.
所以并不是生酮饮食或者高脂肪饮食有什么神奇的魔力，只是因为它们让你减少了热量的摄入而已。
What about the claim that if you follow a ketogenic diet, you can preserve your glycogen, which means you won't run out of glycogen?
那我们在吃生酮饮食的过程当中呢，也可以更有利于我们去储存糖原。
Yes, and studies have shown that. But remember, when you start exercising at higher intensities, you rely more on carbohydrates. So if I'm going to be burning more fats, this is only going to preserve my glycogen stores if I'm doing low to moderate intensity, and nothing more than that.
但一定要记住的是，只有在中低强度运动的时候，生酮饮食才能帮忙我们去储存糖原，因为高强度运动的话是需要依赖于碳水化合物功能的。
Then there's been studies that have tried to address the concern that people say if you don't train hard, you will lose strength and power, because high-intensity training is how you preserve strength and power, but high-intensity training also requires carbohydrates.
那另外就是呢， 我们也不能够太长期的去摄入生酮，因为它会影响到我们整体的一个力量和爆发力，因为这些可能也会更多的偏向于用碳水来供能。
So when we look at the studies that have examined strength and power losses, there's one big problem. The studies are very short, they're less than 30 days.
那我们要看一下关于力量和爆发力与生酮饮食的研究，它们的时间都是非常短暂的。
There's a problem with that. Generally, as humans, when we gain strength and power, and then we stop training, we don't see much of a detraining effect in the first month. What happens afterwards is more rapid losses. So these studies were biased in that they were looking at losses in the first 30 days. They were not really long enough to show what really would be happening to strength and power.
但事实上，力量跟爆发力的训练在初始的第1个月当中，没有一个特别明显的可研究的价值。那一般情况下，这个研究都是短于30天的，所以它没有告诉我们一个更长远的影响会产生什么样的问题。
So, just kind of spend a little bit of time talking about ketogenic diets. What I have there is some questions, and hopefully you can look at some of the answers. Kind of test yourself just to see if you're starting to understand some of the metabolism and the roles of ketones.
那我们接下来呢，就为大家准备了一些问题，你们可以通过回答这些问题来检验一下自己有没有明白刚刚我们所有课程涉及的内容。
Okay, so let's switch our gears and let's talk about intermittent fasting.
好，那接下来时间我们要来探讨一下间歇性进食。
So intermittent fasting is a different approach to eating and weight loss.
那间歇性进食呢，它其实是一个跟我们日常饮食完全不同的关注方法。
Now, diets tend to restrict the type of foods you eat. Intermittent fasting is not so much of a diet, it's more of an eating schedule.
那我们平时的一些饮食方法，更多的关注的是你怎么去安排自己的营养素，关注你吃什么。但是间歇性进食呢，更多关注的是你如何安排进食的时间，在什么时候吃。
And when we talk about an eating schedule, we generally cycle between periods where we're not eating and periods where we are eating, hence the word intermittent fasting.
那间歇性进食它主要的组成部分就是它关注人们什么时候要吃东西，什么时间不能吃东西。
So it really focuses less upon what you're eating, and it focuses more upon when you're eating.
所以就像我们刚刚说过的，它更关注的是比较少的关注吃什么，更多的关注的是什么时候吃。
And so the origins of intermittent fasting really came out of, number one, is understanding what was happening to some people when they were going through these periods of time without food because of religious reasons like Ramadan.
那我们要去了解间歇性进食的话，就要知道在很长一段不能吃东西的时间里面，我们的身体会产生什么样的变化。
The other reason why it was explored is because when we look at the adherence and the success of a typical diet where we restrict food every day, the adherence rates are very bad. So this was an exploration to find something better.
那我们为什么会去关注间歇性进食？还因为在平时的生活当中，我们把饮食做一个自然的分割和控制，效果好像没有很好，所以我们才会寻找其他更佳的方法。
And so we generally break up intermittent fasting into the types of fasting you're doing, and there's 4 basic categories of intermittent fasting.
那我们现在要跟大家介绍一下目前比较常见的4种进食的方法。
So the first one is called prolonged or periodic fasting. And generally what that means is that you are going to infrequently do a long fast. It could be 1 day to 2 days, and it's done every few weeks perhaps. That is less popular, so we're not going to talk about it.
那这个第一个就叫做长时间的一个进食，它讲的是我们在经历过1周或者2周的正常饮食之后，要有一个比较长时间的，比如说1天到2天的不能吃东西的过程。但它的流行度非常的低，所以等一下我们不会去探讨这个部分。
Then we have what we call complete alternate day fasting, which means a person will have one day where they eat no foods that contain calories, and then they have a next day where they can eat as what they want, and they just keep alternating between eating and not eating on a 24-hour period.
那还有一种方法叫做隔日进食，就是要求受试的人，他有一天是完全不能够吃有能量的食物或者饮料的，另外一天呢，他就可以随便吃自己想要吃的东西。
And so some people participate in these types of fasts for health reasons, and there is some research supporting that it works, however, it is difficult to follow.
那确实会有一些研究显示，像隔日进食这样的方法能够给我们带来一些好处，但是它确实很难去遵从。
Because going for 24 hours without food is very difficult for some people to do.
这个是因为对于一些人来说，24个小时完全不吃东西是一件很困难的事情。
So what has evolved out of this concept has been two other approaches. One is called modified fasting regimens, and one is called time-restricted feeding.
所以后来呢，我们就对这个进食的方法进行了一个升级和改良，把它变成了2种方法。第一个叫做改良版的进食方案，另外一个就是限制进食时间。
So both of these are very popular techniques. However, as we talk about the research, you're going to realize that one is much better than the other.
那我们接下来的时间呢，就会去讨论跟这2种方案有关的一些进食方法，而且以及它的相关研究。目前市面上它们都是比较流行的状态。
So modified fasting is where on the fasting days you are allowed to eat, but you eat a small amount of calories, and you only do this maybe once, twice, or 3 times a week, kind of like a 5-2 approach. The only caveat is that the fasting days must not be consecutive days. They must be separated with normal days in between.
那我们要知道，改良版的进食方案呢，它其实跟市面上流行的5-2断食法非常的像，就是你在某连续的或者是不连续的2天之内，摄取比较少的能量，剩下的5天可以正常的吃东西。
So the idea here is on some days of the week, we just eat normally. But on other days of the week, what we do is we intentionally drop our calories down to a very baseline model, and over time that helps us lose weight.
那它其实遵循的就是5天正常的吃饭，另外2天把我们的能量摄入压到一个比较低的基准线上，然后保持我们瘦身的一个效果。
And then the other technique that's very popular in fitness is what we call time-restricted feeding, where you eat what you want in a certain piece of time, and then you have a fasting window where you don't eat.
那另外限制进食时间的这个饮食方法也非常的流行，它会把一整天的时间切成2段，一段时间里面你可以随意的摄入能量，另外的时间就不能够吃东西了。
And so with the time-restricted feeding, generally a very popular one is a 16-8, where people will eat for 8 hours, so between 12 o'clock lunchtime and 8 p.m. they will eat, and then they will fast for 16 hours. That is one example of time-restricted feedings.
限制进食当中最流行的一个方法就是16:8，要求人们16个小时不能吃东西，还有8个小时可以正常的饮食。
However, there are other ones. There are some time-restricted feeding protocols where they only allow you to eat for 6 hours, some even for 4 hours, some even for 2 hours of the day.
当然还会有一些其他类似的方法，要求人们只能在6小时、4小时或者2小时之内进食，其他时间都不能吃东西。
And so if we look at the research on these studies, what do we find generally when we look at all intermittent fasting studies?
那我们接下来的时间呢，就要来看一下跟间歇性进食相关的一些研究。
So most of the studies, to be honest, have been focused on animals like rats. Human studies are limited at this point, but they do show promise, and you can see a lot of the benefits. I've listed some of them that are being demonstrated with some intermittent fasting.
那目前为止，大部分关于间歇性进食的研究都是动物实验的，比如说大鼠。关于人类的实验相对来说会比较少一点，但是他们却证明了间歇性进食是有一定效果的。
Now, here are some problems. I'm going to focus on some of the studies comparing some of these types of fasting approaches.
那我们接下来就为大家呈现一些这些研究的结果。
So, when we talk about weight loss, again, weight loss is all about creating a calorie differential. Eat less calories, burn more calories.
那我们每次聊到减肥的时候，其实都离不开能量赤字这件事儿，也就是我们要吃的少一点，消耗的多一些。
So what we find in intermittent fasting is that the weight loss is not bad, but it's not any better than just regular dieting.
那我们会发现间歇性进食它对于减肥的帮助其实是还不错的，但是跟正常的能量限制相比的话，相差也没有很大。
But what we do find is that when people tend to fast, some people will binge eat as a compensation the next day, but other people actually will consciously start to eat less calories, and that helps promote sustained weight loss.
当我们提到进食这件事情的时候，有的人可能只能在短时间当中去完成，有的人就可以持续的去进行一个热量上的限制。
So we believe that intermittent fasting may help people lose weight, or it may help people deal with their obesity.
那我们是相信一点的，间歇性进食确实可以帮助人们解决肥胖的问题，保持更好的身材。
But what I want to pay a little bit more attention to is the difference between people who eat in the morning, right, and people who perhaps do the 16-8 where they only eat at lunchtime.
那我们现在要看一下吃早饭的人跟不吃早饭，就比如说他用16:8断食，从午餐才开始吃的人有什么区别？
So, when we compare people that are doing early morning feeding versus early morning fasting, we see some very significant results.
那我们在对比吃早饭跟不吃早饭的人之后，会发现一些比较有趣的结论。
So, when people were skipping breakfast, in other words, they were fasting and not eating until lunchtime, what the study shows that their levels of ghrelin is a hormone that is an appetite stimulant, was more elevated during the day versus people who actually ate in the morning.
那和吃早饭的人相比，那些不吃早餐的人，他们血浆当中的胃饥饿素的水平很高。胃饥饿素呢，是刺激我们想吃东西的一种激素。
Why is that important? Because if your ghrelin levels are higher, you might be inclined to eat more.
那这件事情是非常重要的，因为如果你血浆当中的胃饥饿素含量更高的话，就意味着你更容易吃下更多的东西。
Another thing they looked at is insulin sensitivity. Your insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning. Let me explain to you what that means.
那我们早上的时候还要去关注的一个点就是胰岛素的水平。胰岛素水平一般情况下，在不吃早餐的那一天，会出现午餐后血糖跟胰岛素水平更高的状态。
So imagine you eat 10 grams of carbohydrates. It needs a certain amount of insulin. If you eat that 10 grams in the morning versus later in the day, in the morning you need less insulin to move those carbohydrates into the cell. Later in the day, you're going to need more insulin to move that same amount of carbohydrates into the cell.
这是因为在早晨的时候，人体的胰岛素敏感性是最高的。所以你吃一部分的碳水化合物的话，我们只需要少量的胰岛素，就能够让它进入到我们的血液当中去，维持我们的血糖的一个运转。但是如果你放在午餐吃同样的碳水化合物，胰岛素敏感性变低之后，就需要分泌更多的胰岛素。
You might be wondering, so why is that important? Well, understand one thing. The hormone insulin suppresses fat metabolism in the body. So if I have more insulin in circulation, I have less metabolism. So when you're in the morning and eating, you're going to produce less insulin to correct those carbohydrates in your blood. That means you're not going to impede fat metabolism as much as you would if you waited to eat later in the day.
那很多人可能就会觉得说，这个东西我为什么要去了解它？胰岛素在我们身体当中属于一种合成类的激素，如果它的分泌量变大的话，就意味着我们的身体更容易去合成脂肪。那如果在早餐的时候吃碳水比较多，但是因为胰岛素敏感性高，它分泌量就变少，所以这个时候呢，更容易帮助我们去减肥。
Another very interesting thing is got to do with muscle protein synthesis. What we've learned through recent research is that the best way to support muscle protein synthesis is to eat protein frequently through the day, at least 4 times through the day.
还有另外一项很好玩的研究是关于肌肉蛋白合成的。那我们会发现，至少每天要4次频繁的摄取蛋白质，才能够保证肌肉蛋白的最佳合成率。
So, other things to consider. We also, as I've talked about, is we have this insulin sensitivity that is more elevated in the morning than in the night. And what we're finding is that if you wait till eating later in the day, the high levels of insulin can actually start to elevate your markers of diabetes and your risk of diabetes to the body.
那我们前面讲到过了，胰岛素的敏感性是从白天到晚上逐渐下降的，所以如果你在太晚的时候吃下更多的食物，其实会增加我们患上2型糖尿病风险的。
Another thing they've looked at is looking at the bacteria that live in our intestinal tract that help facilitate digestion and absorption and keeping a healthy intestinal tract, that the bacteria are more active in the morning than they are later in the day.
那我们其实整个胃肠道当中的生物节律也是一样的，它们的胃排空和血液流动量都是在早上最大，所以我们在早上进食更多的食物，对健康来说也是有帮助的。
They also did a study where they were looking at men who were eating in the morning versus men that were eating kind of through the day. And they found that if you eat in the morning and then stop eating earlier in the day, like for example between 7 and 3, you actually see lots of improved benefits to your health.
我们还会有一个实验，专门去对比了早上的时候限制进食跟日常饮食大概在12小时左右这样的一个对比，会发现如果我们早上早点吃，然后在下午的时间能够快速的去进食的话，能够得到很大的身体改善。
And so let's end here by having a conversation on comparing the 5-2, which is one of the popular ways of going through fasting, against the classic 16-8, which is very popular in fitness.
好，我们接下来的时间呢，会跟大家一起来比较一下52断食跟16:8之间的区别。
So remember, the 5-2 is a modified fasting regimen. The 16-8 is time-restricted feeding.
那52断食法呢，它其实是把我们一整周切成了5天加2天这样的一个方法，而16:8呢是把一整天的时间进行了分割。
So the problem that we have is if you choose to not eat until 12 o'clock and then only eat in that window, there are several things that I'm worried about or concerned about.
那如果我们花很长的时间不吃东西，然后只在特定的窗口期吃东西的话，其实会有一些是需要担心的部分。
Because you're going for so long without food, it might be possible during that 8 hours that you binge eat, which means you're eating a lot of calories that would equal the same amount in the day, which means you may not be eating less calories, and therefore you may not be losing weight.
那我们会发现，如果长时间进食，比如说16个小时完全不吃东西，就会导致那个人在8小时的时间内疯狂的摄入食物，然后引发热量过度的摄入，这个其实对减肥可能也会没有帮助。
We also talked about how if you're not eating in the morning, your ghrelin levels get elevated and your insulin sensitivity decreases when you eat later in the day.
那我们前面有探讨过，如果早上不吃饭的话，会对我们的胰岛素的敏感性，然后我们的胃肠道的蠕动都会产生一定的影响。
So what does that mean? That means you might end up eating more food and also you might be inhibiting fat metabolism.
那这就意味着，如果遵循16:8的话，可能会让我们出现过量进食，以及得不到正常吃早饭的一些好处。
The other thing that I'm concerned about with the 16/8 is that you are not eating protein consistently through the day, which means you might be slowing down muscle protein synthesis in your body.
那另外呢，当我们用16:8这个方法的时候，就会导致你身体里有很长的时间没有办法摄入蛋白质。而我们前面说过了，蛋白质至少要摄入4次频繁的摄入，才会让我们的蛋白质有更好的一个合成状态。
So another approach, rather than doing time-restricted feeding like a 16/8, is we do what's called modified eating regimens like the 5-2, which is very, very popular, and it does have a lot of science behind it.
那我们可以看一下，相比于16:8、5:2的话，相对来说可能会更好一点。
Now, the traditional idea of a 5-2 means on 5 days of the week, you generally eat your normal food, maybe being a little mindful, and all we do is we do fasting on 2 days of the week, where we take your calories down to 20 to 25% of what you normally eat.
传统的5:2断食呢，要求我们在一周当中的5天正常摄入能量，剩下的2天把自己的能量摄入控制在平时的20%到25%之间。
Now, the rules around this are pretty simple. One rule is the 2 fasting days, if you're doing a 5-2, must not be on consecutive days. They must be spread or have regular eating days in between them.
那我们要去注意的是，最好可以把断食的这2天分隔在一周当中，而不要让它们成为连续的2天。
Number 2 is on those fasting days, what you typically do is you taper down your exercise and you save your exercise for the regular days. You just taper down the exercise on the non-fasting days.
那我们还要注意的是，在进食的那一天呢，最好是减少你的运动量，或者是完全不进行运动。
Now, the rules are you don't only have to do 2 days a week. You can do a 6-1 where you might just start with fasting 1 day of the week. You could also go to a 4-3 where you're alternating every day.
那我们也可以尝试着去对它进行一些调整，比如说你可以6天进食，一天不吃东西，或者是把它调成4:3这样的一个方法。
So which one you choose, 6-1, 5-2, 4-3, depends on you. Just remember, on your fasting days, you're not supposed to exercise, or you're supposed to taper down your exercise. Maybe it's yoga or stretching. So if you like to exercise 5 days a week, then you shouldn't be doing a 4-3.
那无论是选择5:2、4:3还是6:1，这个都是依据你的个人状况，但一定要记得，在不吃东西的那一天呢，尽量减少或者是不锻炼。如果一定要运动的话，瑜伽或者是拉伸会是比较好的选择。如果你希望自己一周能够保持5天的运动量，4:3就不是应该选择的一个方法。
The other rule is that you don't have to go down to 20 to 25%, because sometimes that's a little strict. For example, if you're eating 2,500 calories in a day, and I take it down to 20 to 25%, you're going to be eating 500 to 600 to 700 calories in a day. That is not many calories.
那在某种情况下，我们也不一定非得严格要求自己在不吃东西的那一天把热量控制到20%的和25%之间，因为如果这样的话，你可能一天只有500到600大卡的热量摄入，这个其实是很少的。
So you might want to start with a more moderate approach where you might only reduce calories to 40% or maybe 50%. You don't have to go all the way to about 25% initially.
所以你可以选择的方式是把热量降低到平常的40%或50%之间，这样可能会更容易让你开始。
Obviously, the more calories you can reduce, the faster your weight loss would be.
那我们会发现， 你的能量限制越严格的话，减肥的速度就会变得越快。
But here's how you approach the feeding in the fasting days. It's very unique.
那我们会发现，在断食的期间，我们一定要注意自己的一个整体的能量，达到一个很好的控制。
So let's use 600 calories as my example.
那我们用600大卡来作为一个例子。
What we're going to do is we're going to wake up in the morning, and in the morning you have a little breakfast. That breakfast should contain a small amount of carbohydrates and a little bit of protein so that you overcome that overnight fast.
那我们要去做这个断食的时候，当你每天早上醒来，你就可以先吃少量的碳水和一点点的蛋白质。
Why are we giving you some carbohydrates? Because as you were sleeping overnight, your liver tank was emptying, if you remember our conversation from earlier, and that elevates the cortisol levels, and cortisol can attack muscle protein. So we eat a little bit of carbohydrates to put them back into the liver tank so that we can lower the cortisol levels.
那我们之所以给大家去吃一些碳水化合物，是经过一整晚的睡眠之后，我们的血糖和糖原得到了很大的消耗。如果不吃的话呢，身体就会比较容易倾向消耗蛋白质，所以适量的补充碳水可以帮助我们去节约蛋白质。
We also want to put some protein in there because what protein can do is if cortisol is present and it wants to attack amino acids, we let it attack food amino acids rather than your muscle tissue.
那我们给大家吃一些蛋白质的原因是，如果我们饮食当中没有足量的蛋白质，身体可能会倾向于把肌肉当中的蛋白质分解去进行糖异生。那这个时候，我们如果摄入了蛋白质的话，就会防止这个状况。
And then what we do is with the rest of your calories, so if you think about your morning, it might only be 120 to 150 calories. Now the rest of the calories, we space them out through the day, maybe 2 or 3 more meals, and we make it high protein and high fat.
那在接下来的剩下的卡路里当中，你可能早餐只吃掉了100到200大卡之间，剩下的卡路里我们就可以把它平均分配到一天当中，吃2到3餐，吃高碳水和高脂肪。
Well, we know why we're doing high protein, so that you don't attack muscle protein, but we do high fat so that you start to feel full, and that can help control your appetite.
我们要去吃高蛋白质和高脂肪，这样子可以帮助我们去增加整体的一个饱腹感。
So typically, this process of using some days of the week to fast, it's a better approach because, number one, you don't disrupt your entire week. You only have to fast 1, 2, or 3 days of the week, which means the other days you can live a normal life.
那我们会用到5-2断食法，一个很好的理由是，它不需要你一整周都处于一个饮食控制状态，你只需要挑出1到3天来进行饮食控制就好了。
However, when you reduce the calories down to about 25%, you are going to be hungry. That's why we're giving you fat to try and keep you full. So it's important on those fasting days, whether you do 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days, that you don't exercise or you don't exercise hard, because we don't want to drain energy any further, which would make you even more hungrier.
那在断食的那个时候，我们一定要注意，如果把热量压得比较低，我们是很容易产生饥饿感的。这就是为什么我们在饮食里面一定要吃比较多的脂肪来维持饱腹感。另外就是要减少或者完全不进行锻炼，因为运动也会导致我们比较容易进入到饥饿的状态。
And so what I want to do in the last table is just compare this 5-2 approach against a traditional diet.
那我们最后的表格呢，就把间歇性的进食跟传统饮食进行了一个对比。
So imagine you're someone who eats 2,400 calories on a day.
那我们来想象一下，如果一个人他一天要吃2400大卡。
So on a traditional diet, if I was trying to reduce your calories, let's say 700, maybe 800 calories, I would have to restrict your food intake every day, all right, which would get me some weight loss. But my question is that the only way I can do that?
传统的饮食控制方案，如果一个吃2400大卡的人想要减肥，他可能每天要减少700大卡左右的热量摄入，这意味着他每天都要进行饮食控制。
Because what you could do with the 5-2 is on the 5 days that you're allowed to eat normally, we just want you to be a little bit more mindful. Maybe control some of your portion sizes. Maybe don't have one extra serving of food. And maybe on those 5 days, I can just shave a little bit of calories off the top.
那我们可以看到5-2断食法的话，它只需要有2天的时间去控制热量，剩下的5天正常去进行它的饮食。
But then on the 2 fasting days, we drop a tremendous number of calories out of your food. But if you look at the outcomes at the end of the week, they're very close. You are losing about the same amount of weight between the 2 techniques.
但是你可以看到，传统的饮食方案跟间歇性进食带来的减脂效果几乎是差不多的。
But the biggest difference is this. When you follow a traditional diet, you have to plan and restrict every day. When you're doing something like the 5-2, you only have to plan and really restrict on 2 days of the week, maybe 3 days of the week, maybe 1 day of the week, which means you can live a normal life the other days of your week.
但这两者之间最大的区别是，如果你进行传统的饮食控制，你需要每天都为自己去设置热量进行限制。但是如果用间歇性断食的5-2断食方法的话，你只有1周当中1到3天的时间是需要进行规划跟限制的。
The other advantage of a 5-2 is that it doesn't have to be the same 2 days every week. So this week it could be Monday and Thursday, but let's say you have plans to go out with your friends next Thursday, you can change it to Monday, Friday. As long as they're not consecutive days, you just have to have some regular days in between. So it makes the 5-2 a very easy program to follow.
5-2断食法更容易去遵循的一个原因是，它没有规定2天不吃东西的时间必须是固定的。比如说这周你选择了周1和周3，但是下周周3你需要跟朋友一起出去，你就可以把它调整成周1和周4。
So, to summarize, we started talking about ketogenic diets, and what we've learned about ketogenic diets is that there's nothing magical about the diet other than when you're on a high-fat diet, you tend to eat less calories.
那我们来总结一下，我们首先跟大家一起讲了生酮饮食，会发现生酮饮食其实并没有什么魔力跟特别的，只是因为你的脂肪摄入量比较高之后，自然而然的总体热量就降低了。
So ketogenic diets do have some opportunities to help you lose weight, but you also have to appreciate they're very difficult diets to follow. Because when you restrict carbohydrates to 50 grams a day, it is very difficult to do.
生酮饮食呢，虽然可以帮助我们带来一些减重的效果，但它真的是太难遵循了，因为你每天的碳水摄入要压低在50克左右。
And so, when we think about it, it's not the macronutrient that makes the difference, it's the calories that makes the difference. So if we find other approaches where we can control the number of calories you're eating, that will help us lose weight.
所以重点不是我们要去增加脂肪的摄入量，而是应该控制热量。所以你只要找到其他的可以帮助你去进行热量限制的饮食方式，就能够让你去减肥了。
So if a ketogenic diet doesn't work for you, another option is to try this new concept called intermittent fasting.
所以如果生酮饮食对你来说没有什么帮助的话，间歇性进食是可以进行选择的一个方式。
And while I shared with you that there's different types of intermittent fasting, the popular modality that we see in fitness, like the 16-8, is not the best approach.
那在我刚刚跟大家展示的所有间歇性进食当中，16:8可能不是一个特别好的选择。
So I've explained to you that eating in the morning is actually a very good thing for you. So the 16-8 does not allow you to eat in the morning. That's why we don't really support that type of protocol.
那我们刚刚在解释的过程当中，有跟大家分享吃早餐这件事情对我们能够带来很多的帮助。可是16:8通常是不推荐大家吃早餐的。
But I also shared with you that it's important to feed protein frequently through the day. If you're only eating for an 8-hour window, you are not getting protein through the day, which means you are not optimizing opportunities for muscle protein synthesis.
而且我们还强调了，如果想要更好的肌肉蛋白的合成，我们需要把蛋白质 分割在全天当中至少吃4次。可是如果你是在8小时的窗口期去吃蛋白质的话，就没有办法很好的去刺激肌肉蛋白的合成了。
So why we like the 5-2 is it because it gives you the best of everything. You are eating in the morning, which means you can get protein feedings multiple times through the day. You're also eating in the morning so that you are taking advantage of when insulin is most sensitive. You are eating in the morning so that you can also control your ghrelin levels later in the day.
那5:2的话，就能够给我们带来前面说过的所有的好处。你如果早上吃饭的话，而且你全天频繁的摄入蛋白质，就能够促进我们肌肉蛋白的合成，也能够去利用到我们的胰岛素敏感性，让我们的脂肪不会导致我们的胰岛素过量分泌，让身体进入到一个更多的合成状态。同时呢，也可以利用好我们的胃排空的一个时间段。
On the 16-8, all right, the problem is there is no control of the calories you're eating. So you might be binge eating during that 8-hour windows, which means you're not creating a caloric deficit, which means you may not lose weight.
那我们还要注意的是，16:8的话，因为16个小时的饥饿可能会导致你在8小时窗口期吃太多的食物跟热量，反而没有办法帮你去减肥。
But when you follow the 5-2, first of all, you can live a normal life most of the days and exercise and do the things you want to do because you only have to fast on set days of the week.
那如果你遵循的是5:2的话，在正常进食的那几天当中，你可以吃自己想吃的，然后做自己想做的运动，你的生活是不会被打乱的，只有剩下规划跟限制。
And so on the 5-2, we are intentionally controlling the calories, which will help you lose weight. And more importantly, we're also being smart. On the days that you are fasting, even though you're eating throughout the day, we try and intentionally taper down or not exercise so that we don't, unfortunately, burn through some unnecessary muscle protein.
那我们5:2断食法呢，还有一个好处就是在2天不吃东西的时间里面，我们要求大家不要去做运动，这样就不会导致能量摄入不足的情况下去运动，引发更多的肌肉被消耗掉。
So, hopefully, in this time we've had together, I've been able to share a little bit more insight so that you understand ketogenic diets and you understand intermittent fastings and you see some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of them.
所以通过今天这堂课呢，我们帮助大家去了解了生酮饮食还有间歇性断食它们的好处跟坏处。
So with that said, I want to thank you, Shishe, for being in the session with us today. I want to thank Cindy again for doing a wonderful job translating. I want to thank Lee and her team at Idea China for hosting this event. And as I said, keep learning and getting better.
最后呢，我非常感谢大家能够参与到这堂课程当中来，也希望大家能够持续的去进行学习，然后获得更好的一些方法。Okay. Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.